Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is moving forward with a vote on something that seems destined to fail. His reason: that senators need to be held accountable for their stances on voting rights.
When this chamber confronts a question this important, one so vital to our country, so vital to our ideals, so vital to the future of our democracy, you don't slide it off the table and say, never mind. Win, lose, or draw, members of this chamber were elected to debate and to vote, especially on an issue as vital to the beating heart of our democracy as voting rights. And the public is entitled to know where each senator stands on an issue as sacrosanct as defending our democracy.
Senator Schumer has promised another vote, which will also likely fail, to change the rules of the filibuster. Democratic Senators Manchin and Sinema have frequently voiced their opposition to any such change and have drawn heavy criticism from other members of their party for it. The future of the president's signature climate and social spending plan is also in jeopardy. Now there's talk of breaking it up into smaller pieces as prospects for passing the entire package diminish. The White House has dismissed a report that it is preparing an alternative spending package. Meanwhile, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is planning to establish an election crimes agency with a special police force to oversee state elections. It would be the first force of its kind. And Governor DeSantis is suggesting its deployment despite any evidence of widespread voter fraud. Last month, DeSantis proposed reestablishing the Florida State Guard, which he says would not be, quote, encumbered by the federal government. And in Texas, the 6-week abortion ban will remain in place. A federal appeals court ruled against sending the case back to the trial court judge who had previously blocked the measure. For more, I want to bring in Nancy Cordes, Meridith McGraw, and Eliza Collins. Nancy is CBS News chief White House correspondent. Meridith is a national political correspondent at Politico, and Eliza is a congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Nancy, let me start with you. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, says that the president thinks Americans should see where their leaders stand on voting rights, echoing what Senator Schumer said on the Senate floor earlier. Ultimately, even if he has significant political support, it comes down to the Senate. So what is the strategy for building public support if you don't have the Senate?
Well, I think the White House sees it, frankly, Elaine, the other way around. They're hoping to build enough public support to put pressure on the members of the Senate to change their positions, because right now President Biden is just shy of the number of Democrats he needs in order to change the rules of the Senate so that he can pass this major voting rights legislation. So he's hoping that if he talks about this issue enough, if they hold these votes, that perhaps it will lead to a drumbeat of pressure on those two Senate Democratic holdouts, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, and also that potentially it'll put more pressure on the Republican senators who universally oppose this legislation. There's now talk of a change in strategy among Democratic senators because they realize these votes are destined to fail. They just don't have the numbers without Manchin and Sinema. So now they're talking about perhaps a new measure that would make a change to the filibuster, a new change requiring a talking filibuster. That would mean that the minority could still stand in the way of a simple majority vote, but they'd have to continue speaking on the Senate floor to do it for days on end. Now, it is unlikely that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are going to back that new strategy either. So what you basically have are Democratic leaders sort of casting about for the next step here, and it's hard to see exactly what that step would be that would lead them to a different outcome than what they're facing right now.
And with that potential different approach, Nancy, the point being there would be no sort of anonymous kind of positions, correct?
Right now, what the minority can do is basically threaten to filibuster, and that's enough to prevent legislation from coming to the floor for a vote if it doesn't have the support of 60 or more senators. This change would say, okay, well, you can still block it, but only if you and your colleagues are willing to, talk for hours and days on end on the Senate floor. Sort of think of Mr. Smith goes to Washington, speaking there all night long on the Senate Senate floor. At the end of the day, though, nobody can speak forever. And so the idea is that ultimately whoever was trying to block the vote would have to step aside, give way. And that's probably what Manchin and Sinema are going to object to. They're going to say, most likely, that that is too fundamental a change to filibuster rules. It takes away precious rights of the minority that they say will be important to Democrats if and when they are in the minority again.
Well, Eliza, as the Senate faces this vote, what has Majority Leader Schumer's leadership been like?
Well, it's very tough to be leader in a 50-50 Senate, and I think across the board, Democrats give him a lot of credit for that. And his caucus really spans the ideological spectrum. We have Manchin and Sinema on one side, and you have people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the other. So it's a really tough job. But what we've been hearing in our reporting, we had a story today about Schumer's leadership, is that there is frustration within the caucus, especially from aides, about his handling of Manchin and Sinema over the last year. So over that Build Back Better package, the big social policy, climate, education package that Democrats were negotiating much of the year to get it so that Sinema and Manchin could get on board. There were some key issues people had with Schumer's handling of it. Basically, Manchin and Sinema gave them some ideas and limits over the summer that Schumer knew and didn't tell members of the caucus, or even in one case, Nancy Pelosi, until much later. And so there's a lot of frustration from within his own conference about how he's dealt with them not being public enough. Some centrists say if Manchin was never going to come around to a $3.5 trillion package, why were they talking about it when he had already outlined a package that was $1.5 trillion in a memo to Schumer over the summer? Meanwhile, progressives say, why were they talking about a $3.5 trillion package and getting their hopes up when it was always going to be less? So across the spectrum, we heard some frustration over his handling with both of them, even as Democrats say he's got a really tough job. And pretty broadly, they do support this voting rights push because it's what their voters are looking for.
All right, we'll continue to watch that. Meredith, let's turn to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. The timing of this proposal for an election police force is interesting because it comes at a time when his relationship with former President Trump seems to be fraying. How has Governor DeSantis taken up Mr. Trump's cause of election integrity in their shared home state?
Yeah, the Florida governor is proposing an Office of Election Crimes and Security, and that would be through the Department of State in Florida. So it would fall under the purview of the governor. And what he's proposing is $6 million to hire 52 officials who would then seek out any kind of election fraud or illegal activity there in the state. And there is really nothing like that in any state across the country right now. In the state of Texas, there's a 2021 Texas Election Integrity Unit, but that's a pretty small office of about 10 people. And that doesn't come under the purview of the governor, which is unique in this case. Now, what's also interesting here is that the Florida governor praised his own 2020 election and how Florida handled it. He said that Florida had the gold standard for elections, and he said they really should be the model for other states going forward. So for voting rights advocates, they see this as a way to intimidate voters and to restrict voting rights there in the state. And they say there really is no need. Of the 11 million people who cast votes in Florida last year, there was nothing of the volume of allegations of fraud that would require $6 million and this hiring of 52 people to push back on it. Now, as you noted, this does come at an interesting time in the relationship between former President Trump and Governor Ron DeSantis. There has been tension in that relationship that's started to play out more publicly, with the two trying to differentiate themselves against each other. But what is clear is that DeSantis, like Trump, is eager to move forward with voting rights restrictions. And I think that's one of the reasons why, too, you see such urgency in Congress right now with Democrats who are hoping to push their own federal reforms as red states across the country are trying to put these voting laws in their own hands.
And Meridith, just very quickly, for context as well, Ron DeSantis has not ruled out running in 2024. Is that correct?
No, he hasn't. He's been coy about that, and he's raised an incredible amount of money. He has millions in the bank, and he has a really remarkable network across the country, including some political operatives who have worked with Trump in the past. And while he's been coy about running, a lot of people have their eyes on him as a potential contender if Trump does get in the race, or if he doesn't, that he might put his name on the ballot instead.
All right, to be continued. Eliza, there has been some movement trying to restrict members of Congress and stock activity. What is the president proposing, and where is this coming from?
Well, the White House has really said this is up to Congress because it's a very complicated issue. We've seen bipartisan support for restricting the way members of Congress hold stocks. We've seen proposals to require members to put their stocks into a blind trust, to limit or ban their family members from trading stocks. But at the same time, you also have seen members of both parties who support being able to trade stocks, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who basically said this is a free market and people should be able to take advantage of it. But it's a really interesting topic, and we are seeing some frontline Democrats in particular, so those are Democrats who are up in tough races, get behind this issue. And like I think the graphics you just had on the screen, voters see this as a pretty positive issue across the political spectrum. Voters really do support congressional ethics, and they see, members of Congress who get information, as Senator Mark Kelly told us, they get a lot of information, and voters are worried that they're using that information to trade stocks. But it's a difficult issue when you have literally one of the top leaders of Democrats saying she doesn't support moving forward on something like this.
Well, Nancy, on the pandemic, after weeks of the White House promising at-home testing, Americans can now order COVID-19 tests online, 4 per household. How's the launch going?
Well, they had sort of a soft launch today, Elaine, covidtests.gov. They called it their beta phase, where they just wanted to make sure that all the kinks had been worked out before the site officially goes live tomorrow. But when I went on the site earlier today to order tests, it was working perfectly. And it took me all of 45 seconds to order 4 free at-home COVID-19 tests. And it actually would have taken even less time, except that I initially put in the address of CBS News here in Washington, and I got a pop-up that said that these tests will only be sent to residential addresses, and so I went ahead and changed that. So it is working. Important for everyone to know. After I placed my order, I got an email saying that these COVID-19 tests will start shipping in late January, and USPS will only send 1 set of free at-home COVID-19 tests to valid residential addresses. So the timing could be a little inconvenient for some people who are living in areas of the country, and that's really most of the country, that is seeing a peak of Omicron right now. The fact that these shipments actually won't take place until late January at the very earliest.
Right, and I know you and other reporters had been asking the White House about that and the fact that, could there have been potentially these wheels put in motion earlier? So in anticipation of the holiday rush, I know that's something you have asked them. And what have they said about that? Because there may be some people wondering about that very fact, that we are now, according to a lot of public health experts, perhaps moving through this Omicron surge in a way that we'll see it on the downswing here.
Right. A lot of questions about why this wasn't anticipated. The fact that there might be a huge surge in cases that would deplete the stocks of COVID tests very quickly. What the White House press secretary told us today in the briefing was that they considered actually ordering more tests to distribute freely earlier on in the past couple of months. But at the time, they determined that the market could not supply enough tests to the federal government to make it worthwhile. So she said that is why they decided to wait. But, it's hard to understand why let's say last month, that supply wasn't there, and now suddenly this month it is. Nevertheless, the billion tests have now been ordered, the White House says, and so they should be available later in both, this surge of Omicron, and they say they'll be ready for future variants if they arrive.
All right. Well, Meridith, switching gears, you were at former President Trump's Arizona rally this past weekend. He heads to Texas in just over a week. What can you tell us about what's on tap there?
Well, his rally in Arizona really served as his unofficial kickoff to what's going to be a midterm blitz across the country. I was told by an advisor we can expect to see the former president hold these massive rallies, as many as 2 a month. He was just in Arizona, and his next planned stop is Conroe, Texas. That's outside of Houston at the end of the month, and that comes just ahead of the start of early in-person voting in Texas. That begins on February 14th. Texas's primary is on March 1st. But I think you're going to see a really aggressive push by the former president for candidates that he has endorsed. Ahead of his rally on Saturday, he held a fundraising event for the candidates there in Arizona that he's supported, and he's going to continue to hold events like that for his super PAC that's helping out those people. But at the same time, while he's endorsing candidates and he's going out and doing these rallies across the country, in a lot of ways, he's rebuilding his own clout. There's no doubt that he has held such a powerful position in the Republican Party, despite everything that happened at the end of his presidency. But throughout this past year, he's continued to build up a sizable war chest of money. And while he hasn't announced a 2024 run himself, he certainly has the infrastructure and organization in place to do so if that's what he ultimately decides.
Well, Eliza, we've heard a lot about voting rights, but a lot less about the president's social and climate spending plan. Where do things stand on that?
Well, that was the package that they negotiated for much of last year in the hopes of getting Senators Sinema and Manchin on board. While Sinema never outright said she supported it, she basically dropped off as someone they were really worried about in the last month, and they were trying to get Senator Manchin in December. At the end of the month, he said that he was out on that package. He cited high inflation costs and the way the package was structured. Some programs would only go on for a few years, and Democrats' argument was that they would become so popular, future Congresses would have to renew them. Manchin said that that was not genuine over the cost of the spending bill, which Democrats said would be completely paid for, but with those shorter programs. So there's been some negotiating since on a possible way to bring this package back in a way that Senator Manchin could support. He has said he could support some pieces of it, floating universal pre-K, some climate provisions, some healthcare provisions in December for a smaller package in the $1.5 trillion range. We saw some House members in tough races bring this up last week to their leadership, saying, let's break up this package and start sending smaller bills over to the Senate where they could possibly get some bipartisan support. That hasn't moved much. We haven't seen Democratic leadership get behind that. But I think there's a lot of hope across the Democratic Party that they get something done, because as we've been talking about, these two major signature issues at this moment are both set for defeat.
Finally, Nancy, the president is holding a rare White House press conference on Wednesday. You'll be there. What do you expect he'll be asked about?
Well, he'll be asked about a number of the issues that we've just been discussing, Elaine, most notably COVID-19. What is his outlook and his plan as we move into year 2 of his presidency when it comes to tackling COVID-19? He talked over the summer about our independence from the virus. Obviously, that independence has not occurred. So does he now see this as a virus that we essentially need to live with? And how does he plan to change his policies if that's the case? He'll obviously be asked about voting rights and where he goes from here if his legislative plan is indeed stalled. I'm sure he'll be asked about the economy and inflation. Our polling shows that those are issues of tantamount importance to voters. And then Russia and Ukraine. The White House press secretary just said today that they are concerned about an imminent attack, an invasion by Russia into Ukrainian territory. So how the president is preparing for that and what he's prepared to do if an invasion happens is something he'll likely be asked about as well.
All right, no shortage of topics. Nancy Cordes, Meridith McGraw, and Eliza Collins, thank you all.